Coming up on today's Locked On Bucks, we begin our Flashback Friday series with the choice that you guys made first, overwhelmingly too, and I think it's very timely and a number of fronts. 6 years ago, the Milwaukee Bucks, almost to the day as we record this, 6 years ago, the Milwaukee Bucks announced the hiring of Mike Budenholzer, the changes that he brought to the franchise where Bud was at as a coach and as a part of the NBA community at the time of his hiring, where the Bucks were at. A lot to get into as we go back 6 years ago and look back at the Mike Budenholzer era on today's Locked On Bucks.
You are Locked On Bucks, your daily Milwaukee Bucks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into Locked On Bucks. I'm Justin Garcia here with you. You can find me on the Bucks Radio Network, joined by Camille Davis. You can hear her on the Technical Foul podcast, the Pack a Day podcast, the Carry the G and MKE podcast, in addition to Locked On Bucks Daily. We thank you for making Locked On Bucks your first listen every day. We're free and available wherever you get your podcasts. You can view us on YouTube as well, as a handful of you are jumping into the live stream of today's show. We thank you for joining us, your team, every day. And today's Locked On Bucks is brought to you by LinkedIn Jobs. It helps you find the most qualified candidates you want to talk to faster. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnNBA. That is linkedin.com/LockedOnNBA to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. Camille, I'm not surprised that this was the first choice by the Locked On listeners and fans of the show, given the hiring of Mike Budenholzer very recently in Phoenix with the Suns, and the fact that the further removed we are from the Bud era, as we saw the jokes and the memes throughout the season, but the further removed from it, the further you realize, as Andy once said in The Office, I wish there was a way to know that you were in the good old days as it was happening. So there is that retrospective on Bud. But here we are. I'll look back at the hiring of Mike Budenholzer, which I mentioned almost the anniversary to the day as we record this episode. I believe it was May 16th, 2018, when the Bucks formally announced that Mike Budenholzer, not the formal press conference, but the official announcement came. Mike Budenholzer, the next coach of the Milwaukee Bucks. If you can remember all the way back 6 years ago, your initial thoughts when you heard this, and we'll get to the lead up to it and who the other candidates were and everything surrounding a very interesting, 3 or so year period of Bucks basketball. But your initial reaction when you heard, hey, the Bucks hired Bud?
Excitement. Because when the Milwaukee Bucks let Jason Kidd go halfway through the prior season, I remember having conversations on Tech File with the guys and just saying, we think that the Bucks at this point are just ready for something different. The analogy that we used a lot was looking at the Warriors and saying, okay, here's who they were before they got Steve Kerr with Mike Brown. And it's okay, or not Mike Brown. His name is escaping me right now. Mark Jackson. And it was they were cool with Mark Jackson, but they needed someone else to kind of get them over the hump. And that was Steve Kerr there. And we kept thinking that Jason Kidd was our Mark Jackson here in Milwaukee. Theoretically, you just need a different voice to help them really get to that next level, because you saw the Bucks at that time, Giannis was starting to really come into himself, and you were we might have something really special here. So hearing that we got Mike Budenholzer was okay, we got a coach. This should be really good for the Milwaukee Bucks. I remember being excited, optimistic about what he could bring to the team just based on his track record in Atlanta, although his last season in Atlanta did not go as anybody in Atlanta necessarily thought it would. But looking at what he did before, I was this could be a guy who could be a really good fit for this team where they're currently at right now. So I was pretty excited about it.
Yeah, I was very excited about it. And, as Frank has made popular, the old phrase of never trust the Bucks, there was a lot of that headed into that coaching search, because there was this, how are the Bucks going to screw this up type of vibe that was attached to that search. Bud was a name that surfaced very early. So let's just start with his exit in Atlanta. I believe it was with a late in the season that they agreed to part ways, and he would no longer be the coach of the Hawks. So I think there's some details that it depends on what side you fall on, what to believe, but the general gist of it was Bud was at one point the president of basketball operations, the GM of the team. That came after the 60-win season that the Hawks had, which again, a lot of people pointed to as a fluke. His first year in Atlanta, they go 38-44. His second year was the massive turnaround year. And you think about the players on that team: Al Horford, incredible season that year; Paul Millsap, Kyle Korver, right? Jeff Teague. Bud really maximizing those types of role players into their best possible version. It resulted in a 60-win season and a trip to the Eastern Conference Finals where, like a number of teams before them, they fell short to LeBron James and the Cavaliers. But in that offseason, Bud was given the title of, I think, president of basketball operations, nonetheless. President of basketball operations, Wes Wilcox was named their GM. So he had a lot more say in dictating that roster. And it seems like in talking through the years to some people with the Hawks that I've gotten to know, that's where, if you don't care for Bud, that's where it comes from, is it was his way or the highway. And he put his stamp on the team. And look at some of the personnel decisions he made.
Mm-hmm.
Granted, I would argue they held that group together for a decent amount of time, at least as long as they could. I know this is basically a 5-year run we're talking about with the Hawks. But it wasn't really until that 16-17 season where you started to see some of that turnover and change. And that was Bud's second year in seat as the president of basketball ops. But where I say it kind of depends on, are you team Bud or are you team Hawks? Where that conversation becomes interesting is if you're team Bud, and I've heard some of this, it was really ownership was, we like winning, like we're thankful for what you've done, but we don't envision ourselves as a contender here that we need to pour this money into. And Bud's thought was, look, I've maximized these guys. We've got to bring around some stars and we've got to spend some money. And that didn't happen. And through the years, there was just this decay of that. Right. I mentioned some of those names. I mean, we talked about this before. Jeff Teague was a guy that had the offer sheet from the Bucks, and he nearly left at that point. Ended up going to the Minnesota Timberwolves. Al Horford ends up signing with the Atlanta Hawks for some more money. You traded Paul Millsap in what appeared to be a cap-saving move there. So through the years, and this is by years, I mean 2 years basically, that team just started to decay, and it reached its culmination point late in that 16-17 or 17-18 season, where it seemed as though the organization was thinking we're headed in one direction. Bud didn't want to be a part of that and wasn't looking to be a part of a rebuild. They agreed to part ways. He immediately became the biggest name that was out there on the market. And, when we mentioned Bucks fans, we heard that almost immediately. But I remember, and I'll share this story before I let you jump in here. The end of season press conference after the Bucks lost to the Boston Celtics in 7 games was before the Bucks became the Bucks, where the people around the team at that, not even a press conference, but when the season ends, you get together, and it was much, much looser back then, where we met at the Medical College Center. Yeah. And it was just players would come out one by one. You'd talk to them. You hung out there for 4 or 5 or more hours. That was your last chance to talk to guys. I remember still, it was me, Eric Name, who was not with the Athletic. It didn't exist at that point. Matt Velasquez was covering the team. Telly Hughes was the sideline reporter for the Bucks. That was about it in terms of people that were there from the media. And I remember talking with Joe Prunty, who was kind of addressing hey, Joe, what do you think your chances are of getting this job? And Joe Prunty, I think I have a good chance. And look what we did since I took over. And we took the Celtics to 7 games. And I'm approaching this as I'm a serious contender. I'm a serious finalist. As we saw, that was not the case. Joe Prunty, I don't believe, was even really in consideration for it. He got an interview shortly after the season ended, but the Bucks quickly moved on. So it was interesting seeing that and wondering, man, are they just going to promote Prunty? And then
Right.
hearing Bud becomes available and the other names that come up. And I think from the start, he was the guy that Bucks fans really said, hey, this is the guy that we need to hire here. But as I mentioned, there was always that skepticism. And we heard some other names, some interesting names in digging through this. That's when the Becky Hammon name started to surface as the Bucks possibly linked to that. I believe not quite as serious, but Monty Williams was linked to the Bucks as well. But it seemed like there was just this one thought, and you see it in all sports, where the team that is the most successful, you look at them and say, well, just hire one of their guys. So there is this thought of, we should get a Spurs assistant. And the Bucks, their finalists were 2 Spurs assistants.
Exactly. Now, the Spurs assistant that the Bucks ended up hiring was not the young one that most people were thinking of, because it was, if I mispronounce the name, please correct me, Ettore Messina, I believe it was.
I think it's Ettore, yeah.
Ettore Messina. So it was him and Bud who were like the finalists for that. But what was really interesting to me when I was going back through this, before he actually left the Hawks, Mike Budenholzer was given permission to speak with the Suns and the Knicks as well for their head coach openings. And he pulled out a contention for the Suns job, which is so ironic that now he's back around and he is the Suns head coach.
And I think reading between the lines and what's changed, especially in terms of ownership, I think we know why.
Exactly. And then that too, just going back and remembering that the Raptors also met with Mike Budenholzer, but they never sent in an offer. I remember during that time frame of having the conversation of like, which coaching job is a better opportunity? Is it Toronto or is it Milwaukee? Like, which job would you want at this point? And that Toronto team, as we know, they went on to win a title the next year after Bud's initial year there. But you look at that roster and you think about, like, they had Marc Gasol, still OG Anunoby was young, still there. They had Danny Green, Serge Ibaka. Like, it was just a lot going on with that Raptors team where you're just like, okay, and they got Kawhi that summer eventually. So it was like, okay, like this could be a good opening. But Mike Budenholzer going to Milwaukee was such a good fit for the Bucks. And the way they hired him too, with having, like, it was in the news and everything like that. It's talking about how Giannis and Chris met with Bud before he was hired, because the Bucks wanted to make sure that their preferred candidate and the star players got along. And that was unusual at that time. So it was reported. And just all of that going into it in that hire. And then thinking about the fact that Mike Budenholzer's first year coaching the Milwaukee Bucks also coincides with the first year that Fiserv Forum is open. So like this whole era of Bucks basketball that we think of in Fiserv really started with this Mike Budenholzer hire.
There's a lot to get to and how it all kind of ties together. This era is a good way to put it of Bucks basketball. A couple other points on the other openings, and I do want to get to where the Bucks were at, where Bud was at, a little bit more of that, where the league was at, and the immediate change that we saw, because there was some skepticism there of, when are we going to see the results? How long of a process is this going to be? So we'll continue to pour over all of that coming up here after the break. Still a lot to dig into is the hiring of Mike Budenholzer, a very, very monumental day and period in Milwaukee Bucks basketball. So Camille and I will continue the conversation coming up after the break here on Locked On Bucks. When you're hiring for your small business, you want to find quality professionals that are right for the role. That's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs. It has all the tools to help you find the right professionals. LinkedIn isn't just another job board. They have a vast network of more than 1 billion professionals, which makes it the best place to hire. It gives you access to professionals you cannot find anywhere else. LinkedIn does all of that while making the process easy and intuitive. Hiring is easy when you have that many quality candidates. So easy, in fact. 86% of small businesses get a qualified candidate within 24 hours. LinkedIn knows small businesses are wearing so many hats and might not have the time or resources to hire, and that's why they are constantly finding ways to make the process easier. They even just launched a feature that helps you write job descriptions, making the process even easier and quicker. 2.5 million small businesses use LinkedIn for hiring, and you should do the same. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnNBA. That is linkedin.com/LockedOnNBA to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. All right. You mentioned, Camille, the Phoenix Suns were a team that spoke with Bud, and obviously the connections, as we talked about with Bud. They're growing up just outside of the Phoenix area. His dad, a coach in Arizona, Pomona College, I believe it was, that Bud went to and played basketball and golf at. So that seemed like, I'll meet and hear what you have to say. That was in the Robert Sarver era. Not surprised Bud pulled himself out of the running. The Knicks, another one that you mentioned, and I remember, I believe a year ago, late in Bud's tenure, it wasn't even early. There was a reporter from New York, and I don't want to say the name because I don't remember if I'm accurate, but one of the Knicks reporters asked Bud about that about a year ago. Hey, remember when you were in the running for the Knicks job and you pulled yourself out of the process? What went behind that? Which the timing was interesting to bring it up years down the road. And Bud kind of dismissed the question and said, I don't want to get into that. So there was that. And then there was the Raptors job. As the Raptors, as we would ultimately see, I think, interviewed Bud, but it seems like they knew all along this guy that has been on the staff for Dwayne Casey, and prior to that was coaching our G League club, the 905. This is who we're going to hire in Nick Nurse. So it seemed as though, hey, it's really the Bucks. And I think that was part of it for Bucks fans, is that name immediately what you circled. And I saw a lot of the commentary of, it would be nice to have a coach where it doesn't feel like we're being out coached in every series. Funny how I think a lot of people making those comments would change their tune within a matter of years. But it was just interesting that as the process went on, it really seemed like there were no other options for either of these entities, the Bucks or Mike Budenholzer. And I think as a Bucks fan, you kind of looked around and thought, we're going to hire Bud, but I'm still waiting for the Bucks to screw this up some way.
Yeah, because there wasn't a level of trust. Like, there had been a lot of change with the Bucks prior to that Mike Budenholzer hire. Like, you think about a few years before that, when "own the future" became the phrase of the team, with new ownership, new head coach with Jason Kidd coming in. And that first year with Kidd, the Bucks went 500, and it was like a celebration because they had won only 15 games the year before that. So you're seeing these young Bucks. They took a step back that next year. Then the following year, they were 2 games over 500. And then the fourth year with Kidd, there is the year he was fired, and he was just a game above 500 at the time when he was let go. And then Joe Prunty takes over, and you're seeing the fight of the team here. Like, we're supposed to be owning the future, but we're not necessarily taking steps forward. We need someone to help us take that next step. And Mike Budenholzer coming in also coincides a little bit. If you remember, John Hammond left the Bucks in 2017, like May 2017, to go to the Magic. So there was that also in the background, just some more shuffling going on before Mike Budenholzer gets here. And then once he got here, like, the impact was immediate with Mike Budenholzer, like 60-22 in that very first season with the Bucks. He was coach of the year. Giannis got his first MVP. John Horst was executive of the year. Like, everything just really clicked quickly for the Bucks. Like, he came in and we heard about the 5 boxes being taped around the court with Bud, trying to get the 5-out offense together. And we're all like, wow, really? Like, John Henson's going to be shooting threes? Like, how is this going to work? And then you see that season go. There's some trades made to try to optimize the roster a bit. But when the Bucks got off to like a 25-10 start, I was just watching that season like, oh, we made the right decision. Like, he's unlocked Giannis. Like, that was the first thought I had early on watching the Mike Budenholzer Bucks, was like, Giannis looks really good with all of this space around him. And Mike Budenholzer coming in made me start to reevaluate exactly what the best system would be for Giannis, because having Brook Lopez next to him in that stretch 5, I was like, do we need Giannis to shoot threes actually, if you can stretch everyone else out around him? So the impact when Bud came in was immediate. That first season was so fun to watch after the previous few years of trying to own the future and taking steps back, and just seeing the Bucks come out firing on all cylinders immediately was so fun to see.
Yeah, it was immediate, and I know this is one of the options that we have for Flashback Friday. I don't want to get too much into it, but just the start, 7-0 start. You mentioned those boxes. Everybody that was around the team, if you're at practice, you took pictures of the court, at least what you were allowed to take pictures of, and say, "Hey, here's where the Bucks are positioning their guys." And those lasted for about a 2-year period, I want to say, on the court. The boxes changed from year to year as well. They became much larger to really encourage, hey, this is the general area we need you guys to be in. The 3-point shooting was really the big thing, because I remember having this conversation with our then play-by-play voice, Ted Davis, in going into that season, wondering, okay, well, how much different are they actually going to look here? Like, I would imagine you're going to take some more threes, but like, what are the big changes going to be for this Bucks team? And it like smacked you in the face how immediate it was with the shooting that we saw. That I remember their first preseason game. I don't remember who it was against. I want to say it was the Thunder, but the Bucks took like 50 some threes in that game. And you remember looking around thinking, okay, so I suppose it's going to be like this, huh? They went from a 109.8 offensive rating to a 113.8, which may not seem like a lot. If you increase that by 4 points, that is a massive jump. But even more impressive was defensively. And when we mention the eras of Bucks basketball, it's so interesting in how everything ties into that summer, because you hired Bud, you opened up Fiserv Forum. You mentioned the comment, the word that we heard the most with Bud, unlocked. He used that quite a bit and said, I'm going to unlock Giannis and figure out how to use him. I remember, poking through Reddit as we were preparing for this to see some of the commentary around that hiring, and a lot of comments from people saying, man, 30-point season from Giannis incoming. And it was the truth that we saw Giannis become 30 points per game consistently right around that period in that era. He became a 2-time MVP. John Horst, just a little bit before, but as we mentioned, that was an interesting couple of year stretch where the belief was, man, Jason Kidd is going to become the coach and GM of this team. What happened with Justin Zanuck? So there's a lot to get into with that stuff as well. But also, oh, by the way, you signed a guy named Brook Lopez for what I think it was for one of your exceptions at that point. It was a $5 million deal that you signed Brook Lopez to. What a bargain. You would love to have him at that right now. But there's just so much that changed that's, I think what complicates all of this is, I think a great deal of it is Bud and what he brought, lifting the floor for this team, changing the way they played offense, defense to round at that point. They improved by 5 points per 100 possessions defensively, which again is massive when you think about what's the difference between 1 and 10 in either of those. It's probably 3 or 4 points, really. So a massive jump there. Brook Lopez, a big part of that defense, but this all kind of coincided in creating what has been the second best, maybe the best era of Bucks basketball. It is this, and it is that Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Oscar Robertson era where you won a championship, you played in 2 finals.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And thinking about Bud, and I know we're talking about kind of like his impact and legacy with the Bucks in the next segment a bit, but just thinking about all of the things that were happening with those Bucks teams, like, oh, this is the first time this has happened since the 80s. This is the first time this has happened since the 2001 series. Like, when the first year with Mike Budenholzer in place here, and the Bucks had their first round series against the Detroit Pistons, they swept the Pistons, and that was the first playoff series win since 2001. It was 2019 at that point, and it was the first time the Bucks had won a first round playoff series. And then you get to the Eastern Conference Finals after you beat the Celtics. And it was really thoughts of like, we might really go to the championship in our very first year with Mike Budenholzer here. Of course, as we know, the Bucks ended up losing to the Toronto Raptors in that series. That series was one of the first times I got to see the Bucks playing on my birthday at period, because it's a late May birthday. And I was so excited. Like, the Bucks are really playing basketball late May. Like, we might be playing ball in June. Didn't happen. And then you have the bubble year. And before the bubble, that Bucks team was on a roll as well before that bubble year. that didn't go out. But then you get the championship year after that, which first championship for the Bucks in 50 years. You had Giannis re-sign. You had the Drew Holiday trade. So like it was just sustained success with Mike Budenholzer here, which when thinking about his 5 years in Milwaukee and then how that places just in Bucks history amongst all the coaches we've had, like doing the research, I was actually shocked. Like Mike Budenholzer is easily one of the best coaches in Milwaukee Bucks history when you really look at it.
Yeah, I mean it's indisputable, and I remember when you mentioned that series with the Pistons too. You remember the feeling going into that series where it was, by the numbers, the Bucks are going to win this series. They are a better team than the Pistons, but there was still this thing in the back of your mind that thought, what if this is fraudulent? What if we're not supposed to be here? And as you mentioned, it's 2 decades of losing in the first round of the playoffs that you think, what if we lose again? And when you saw them dispatch the Pistons the way that they did, all of that went out the window, and it was, okay, what we've seen this season, this is legit. We are actually very, very good here. I remember, too, we gave our predictions before the series started against the Boston Celtics on the radio and saying, by the numbers, guys, the Bucks should win this series in 5 games. If you just compare the 2 resumes, remove the team names, nobody's picking the Celtics. If you're picking the Celtics, it's because you see Kyrie Irving. You see the name the Boston Celtics. If I just gave you their numbers, nobody's picking Boston. You would pick the Bucks and say this team overwhelmingly should win. That series, the way that felt too, when you thought, man, not only did the Bucks win a series, they are on to the conference finals, something they hadn't done since 2001. And it just felt like, okay, we are a part of a different class now with this team, and everything that we had hoped for has come to fruition. I still stand by as disappointed as it was to lose to the Raptors. And it's one of the ultimate, which I suppose is another theme that we could launch later this summer, the ultimate what ifs in Bucks basketball. But certainly game 3 in Toronto was one of those. Was it double overtime or overtime? The loss to the Raptors, a very winnable game. You win that, you're up 3-0. It is hard to imagine losing a series. No team has done that before when you're up 3-0. But the further removed I am from that series, I am kind of resigned to, the Raptors were just a better team than the Bucks. But it gave you a lot of optimism to think, okay, everything that we hoped for with this Bud guy, it came true in year 1. And we still have a young team. When you think back to the age of Giannis, of Chris Middleton, Eric Bledsoe, and the way that Bud really utilized him and that duo of Bledsoe pressuring at the point of attack, Brook Lopez, we would see that optimized even more a few years later with Drew Holiday. But there was a lot of young foundational pieces, a coach that had its success in Atlanta and brought even more success to Milwaukee. It felt like an absolute home run less than a year into the hire.
Absolutely. And it made you excited about what was going to come next, because you're like, it was disappointing losing to Toronto in that series the way that it did. Like you see Toronto going to win the championship. And I remember thinking like, if the Bucks could have won that game 3, like we could have been there. And like, we could have probably, if everything happened with the Warriors that happened against Toronto happened against Milwaukee, it's like, I felt like we could have won the championship that year too, which was like mad. Like it was so like we were so close. And I was like, am I asking for too much too quickly? Because we went from not winning a playoff series in 20 some years, it felt like, to now me saying like, dang, we should be in the finals right now. So that, I mean, listen, the Bud era is really special. And I just want to get your opinion too when we come back a bit more about just Bud's place in history, because Bud's tenure in Milwaukee, there was a lot, like the Fire Bud contingent got loud pretty quick because they felt like the adjustments weren't right and so on and so forth. And the other side was like, no, look what he established here in Milwaukee. Like, give him some time. Even at the championship, I mentioned it before, I was shocked that the Bucks won a championship and there's somebody with a Fire Bud sign, where it's like, this is a celebration right now. Like, what are we doing out here? And now we're a season removed from Mike Budenholzer being here in Milwaukee. We've had 2 coaches since letting him go in 1 season, and just kind of thinking about where he stands. Like I mentioned, like he's one of the best coaches in franchise history, but prepping for the show and going back through some of the names who have coached for the Bucks and what they've done and where Bud fits, I was a little shocked to see some of the numbers of just like how well those Bucks teams under Bud stacked up in Bucks history against any other coach's team.
I had the exact same thought. So we will get into that. A couple of loose ends to tie up on going back to the first part of the conversation, how Bud became available and really the last couple of years in Atlanta and how interesting that was, because there was a lot that goes into it. And maybe the Bucks have Danny Ferry to thank for Mike Budenholzer becoming their head coach. So we'll explain that and to take a look at where Bud stacks up against the other coaches in Bucks franchise history. Coming up after this on Locked On Bucks. Passion, drive, and patience. That is the formula for winning championships, and it is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. Superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you will always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay's Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit, only available to U.S. customers. And if you're watching Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day, but you constantly have to reach for the remote and turn down the volume, that means it is time to make the switch to Locked On Sports today. It is a free 24/7 sports streaming channel that is programmed entirely for you every single day, bringing you the biggest stories without all of the screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, news, and it streams 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. A couple of last points to make on Bud in how he broke loose from Atlanta and got to Milwaukee. Again, that team was starting to be torn apart. There were a lot of financial constraints that they were up against. There was a lot of changes in the front office. I mentioned Al Horford signed with the Boston Celtics. That was a huge blow. Paul Millsap, one of those guys too, when you think back, Camille, to the guys of that era of NBA basketball that you think, oh yeah, I forgot the years that he put up, like Danny Granger, Paul Millsap, those types of players. You're like, oh yeah, I remember that. Paul Millsap was a huge piece of that team, and that seemed to signal the writing on the wall when they basically traded him to save money. He was a free agent. It was going to cost a lot to keep him, but they dealt him to Denver in a sign-and trade that got them a future first-round draft pick. Diamond Stone, if we remember that name too, came back in the deal. A very, very cash-saving move. But one thing that I pointed to in passing there was, maybe the Bucks have Danny Ferry to thank for all this. So we mentioned Bud pointed to the president of basketball operations for the Hawks after his first year on the job, and promptly leads them to a 60-win season. They had an opening because of that whole Danny Ferry fiasco. And if you remember, took an indefinite leave of absence after his racially charged comments on a conference call were made public. He was eventually fired, bought out by the Hawks. So they were left kind of thinking, okay, what do we do now? Well, this guy's our coach, and he's doing a pretty good job. He's got a lot of NBA experience, worked under Pop. All right, let's just promote him to president of basketball ops. Wes Wilcox, as we mentioned, becomes the GM to work hand in hand with Bud. And look, again, I'm not trying to absolve Mike Budenholzer of any blame over personnel decisions. I'm sure it was a shared issue there, but it did not go as planned. But you can't help but wonder, one of those sliding doors moments, Danny Ferry didn't prove to be a questionable guy at best. Does this even happen? And do the Hawks have a more structured front office? Do they run into those issues? Probably, given what we said, financial constraints with the ownership group. But it's one of those smaller scale what ifs of, I wonder how much this had to do with Bud eventually leaving Atlanta.
Well, I mean, you hit the nail on the head there because it was Bud did not want to be in a situation where he was coaching a team that was not competing. And the Hawks had got to a point where it was like, okay, we just had this season here where it's the worst season that you've had as head coach here. Like the tanking was on the wall, as you mentioned, some of the cost saving moves that the Hawks were making at that time as well. But your Danny Ferry point, I never thought about it like that, but that is so true. And I think like if it wasn't Mike Budenholzer, I'm not sure if that head coach would have gotten that necessarily that role attached onto it, because although that was Mike's first head coaching gig, as we know, he was with the Spurs for 19 years before he was hired by the Hawks. So he had a lot of experience with an organization where they saw the head coach have a large impact on the roster as well. So Bud stepped right on into that. And to your point earlier in the show that you made, that is another turning point where people's perception of Bud changed, evolved, however the case may be with him taking that position on and having things go his way. I mean, even in Milwaukee, while he did not have that same level of control over the roster, we quickly figured out who Bud guys were. Like, oh, he fits the system. That's a Bud guy. Like he could fit here. That's what he's looking for. And understanding that system going on with him was really interesting, which is why this past year was so like, we would never have drafted Andre Jackson Jr. if Mike Budenholzer here. It's not a Mike Budenholzer type of guy. So it's interesting to think about that. What if the tapes never leaked of Danny Ferry and that never came out? Does Mike Budenholzer get that gig there? No telling how that exactly goes. But let's bring it back to Milwaukee here for a second. I mentioned all the first that the Bucks were able to achieve with Mike Budenholzer as their head coach. And when I was taking a look, just thinking about this show that we were doing and thinking about where does he stand in Bucks history with all the other coaches? And I was like, first I was like, I don't know, maybe he's probably like top 5. And I went through and I was like, okay, top 3 at the very least here, because when you're looking at who some of the other heavy hitters are in Bucks coaching history, of course, you start with Don Nelson, who is just known as being one of the best coaches, period, to ever grace
an
the
all-time
NBA.
great hang, too.
Yes, just period. All-time great. So like Don Nelson, of course, like he never won a championship here in Milwaukee, but Nelly ball and everything that he did, like you've got to give him his respect. He coached the most games here in Milwaukee. Just a legend. And then you look at Larry Costello, who's the other championship winning coach with the Milwaukee Bucks. And then you see, okay, so it's him and it's Mike Budenholzer. And for you, Justin, I'm just curious, like, where do you rank Mike Budenholzer yourself? Because looking at it, like Larry Costello, first head coach of the team, won a championship, like some good things here. But when he resigned, then here comes Don Nelson for his run. And Costello was known for just using videotape, which I was like, this is so interesting thing in the history of the league of like, okay, we're going to study our opponents and we're going to try. Like that was at one point not a thing. So Costello got the championship, and then you got Mike Budenholzer as well, who had the best win percentage before Adrian Griffin came with his half season of nearly
incredible,
not a 70% win percentage, but Mike Budenholzer left the Bucks with a 69% win percentage and an even second best win percentage in the playoffs as well. 60% win percentage in the playoffs. Coach of the year here, championship here. So where do you personally put Mike Budenholzer in the rankings of Milwaukee Bucks coaches?
Yeah, so there have been 18 of them, and what to me, I'll start with this, is just incredible when you think about the first 3 coaches, Larry Costello, as you mentioned, and the innovations that he brought there, bringing the Bucks their first championship, or at least being the coach for the first championship. You go from that to Don Nelson, and then from Don Nelson to Del Harris. That those are your first 3 coaches in franchise history. Yeah, it's fascinating that the Adrian Griffin component there, the win percentage, I would imagine that mark is going to stick around. That I don't envision a coach coaching a shorter period of time than Griff and having a higher win percentage than that 69.8, narrowly edging out Bud. I think that it really comes down to 3 names when you're saying who is the greatest coach in Bucks franchise history. That is Don Nelson, Larry Costello, and Bud. I think by the numbers, Don Nelson is probably the best coach in Bucks franchise history. But there's that, oh, by the way, Larry Costello won a title.
Mhm.
Don Nelson did not. I know he was a part of those staffs for Larry Costello. But I think when you just look at the fact that he won 540 games, more than 100 more than the next in line, which was Larry Costello at 410. So he had 950 wins from that duo alone. Next in line is Bud with 271. And, we think about the previous era when we talk about that of Bucks basketball that was also good came in the form of George Karl. When we think back to that 01 team, a much shorter shelf life, though. I know they made the playoffs 3 straight years under George. 2 of them were first round exits, where it was a team that was clearly on the rise. And then you thought, okay, they're really piecing it together after a conference finals appearance and loss to the Sixers. But little did we know that was the peak, and it was all downhill from there. Bud with 271 for wins. Don Nelson, George Karl for being in that class that we described, 205 wins, right? Even Del Harris, and granted, his time, it bled into the turnaround for the worst of where the franchise headed to. But even Del Harris, only 191 wins. So Bud, in his 5 years, won 271 games. Just think about that and do the math. That equates to what, 52, 53 wins a year, 54 wins a year that we're talking about on average for Bud. And that was another one of those things when we talked about not only, hey, can this team win a playoff series? Can they get home court advantage? Was a lot of the conversation that was going into that season. Hey, they hired Bud. Their offense is going to be better. Maybe they can be a 4 seed, right? Not, hey, the Bucks are going to win 60 and have the best record in the conference. But just the thought of winning 50 games too, you thought, man, that would be nice. We were used to clawing and scratching to get to 38, 39, 41 wins. And then you became basically a given for mid 50s in wins. So there's no way you can put together a list of, if we said a Mount Rushmore of Bucks franchise coaches in franchise history, I would say it would probably be Don Nelson, Larry Costello, Bud, and Del Harris as your 4. He, at the very least, is number 3 on your list. I would almost put him in front of Larry Costello, given the turnaround that he had. Larry Costello did it with an expansion franchise and did reach the finals 2 times. But I think just for where this team was, and what long-suffering fans had been through as well, to see, hey, you know what? You can turn this around if you have somebody leading things that knows what they're doing. The fact that he raised the floor as much as he did, if I put together a list, I would put Don Nelson as number 1, but Bud would be the number 2 coach in franchise history.
Yeah, that's where I landed myself with putting Bud at 2, and Larry Costello at 3 there. But it was a really fun exercise, just kind of going through and reflecting on this era, because I mean, it just came to a close last year. And I think with us doing Locked On Bucks now, a daily show about the Milwaukee Bucks, you're in the weeds a lot and you're just kind of thinking about things on a day-to-day basis, which is why this Flashback Friday series through the offseason is going to be so fun to go into, because it gives us time to take that elevated look at something where it's not in the weeds, the day-to-day aspect of it, but like, let's take a step back and really look at how this whole era played out. And it's still fresh, Mike Budenholzer not being here in Milwaukee, but the Coach Bud era, first championship in 50 years for the franchise. I mean, it was a time where I feel like Mike Budenholzer came in and he really just kind of upped the professionalism of the Milwaukee Bucks. He really helped establish what winning basketball will look like for the next head coaches to continue to build on. And I mean, as long as you have Giannis here as well, you're going to have a pretty good chance of having that winning basketball continue. So it was just really fun kind of taking a look back and thinking about Mike Budenholzer. And even though, through the years, there were some real-time complaints, some valid, some not as much about his coaching style or his adjustments or lack of adjustments at times. Thinking back on it, it was a successful era for Milwaukee Bucks basketball. Now, one might say, I wish we would have gotten more than one during that 5-year reign here, which that's fair. That is fair. And we hear Giannis say all the time, he's not content with just the one. But getting the one was special. It was special.
Yeah, I mean, it was incredibly special. And we talked about this before. When you saw Denver last year, when you see what the Timberwolves are doing now, too, you're reminded of, that's the way that fan base feels. That's exactly where we were at in 2019, but especially in 2021, when you finally climbed that mountain and won the title. And I am very happy that we see a lot more appreciation now that we're removed from it for Bud. You could make a case. Look, it probably had run its course and needed to end. I think what made it difficult was seeing the struggles that the Bucks went through this past season, seeing a perceived lack of structure and organization that Bud was so good at bringing and putting in place. And just, how it ended with Bud too is something that we didn't mention, but that's another thing that really, I think, complicates it and complicates some fans' feelings of the bitter disappointment to lose to that Miami Heat team, especially, but to lose in the first round as a 1 seed, and the kind of, I suppose, embarrassment that comes with that. But then to learn, as we did, what Bud was going through at the time of that series, I think really complicated a lot of fans' feelings too of, I thought maybe it was time to move on, but now knowing this, I don't know. This seems kind of rough to fire the guy after that. So as we mentioned a couple of times, I am very eagerly anticipating that first time that the Phoenix Suns or the time next year that the Phoenix Suns are in Milwaukee, and Bud gets hopefully a standing ovation and warm reception from Bucks fans, which again, in just interacting with Bucks fans and Locked On and on the various radio shows and seeing them on Twitter too, I think that's going to be the case, that it's going to be a very, very strong, positive and warm reception for Bud when the Suns come to town next year.
Yeah, that's the hope. And he deserves that. Like, as you mentioned, like the way that it ended the last year with him as the head coach here wasn't ideal. But again, when you kind of take that step back and really think about everything that happened with Mike Budenholzer coming to Milwaukee, that's worth some applause. So I definitely do hope that when the Suns come to town next year, that he gets that warm welcome that he deserves here, with everything that he did for the city here while he was coaching, and him trying to coach through some really tough personal things there at the end and still showing up night in and night out for this team, which I have made a comment, like if I was in his shoes, I'm not sure if I would have been able to do that. So I definitely have a lot of respect for him and his time here in Milwaukee. And I hope that when he comes, he gets a warm welcome. And every time he does come, unless it's in the finals, that he does get a warm welcome here in Milwaukee.
We've got quite a bit coming up on the show in the coming days here as we all get set for a long weekend. Still TBD as we're kind of hashing it out on the fly, Camille, but still TBD if we're going to do a Monday show or if it'll be saved for Tuesday. If we do a Monday show, I'll let the cat out of the bag now. It is going to be Frank Madden's take on free agency, possible targets, and other moves that the Bucks could make here. We're going to do that show one way or another. It may be Monday. It may be Tuesday. Wednesday, Gabe Stoltz of Brew Hoop is going to join us and share some of his perspective on covering the team, not just last season, but these past few years. Gabe was one of those when I referenced some of the discourse around Bud. He was with Brew Hoop at the hiring of Bud. So we'll get some of his thoughts on that as well, and the direction of this team. So look forward to that on Wednesday. And of course, next week we continue our Flashback Friday series. I think we hashed out what we were going to go with as your options to vote on for the show next Friday. There was a lot of interest in that Brandon Jennings, Brandon Knight trade, which, oh, by the way, also netted the Bucks Chris Middleton. So I think we'll roll that one back out there and see if you guys want to push that across the finish line. There's always some mention of the Bradley Center, so I think that'll be included. And we mentioned the George Karl era and how it ended not so great. Really, the start to that came in 2001, 2002. So that is an option as well. So look for the new poll on our community page on YouTube and to cast your vote for that. And that'll determine what we run for next week, May 31st on the Flashback Friday show. Other than that, we hope everybody gets a chance to relax quite a bit this weekend, take some extended time off, have a long Memorial Day weekend, catch up on some basketball. Maybe we'll have a clearer picture of what the NBA Finals are going to be when we reconvene here next week. But as we mentioned, a lot to look forward to coming up on next week's show. Leave your comments to your lasting legacy of Bud, where he ranks in franchise history in terms of the best coaches, and any thoughts you had on Mike Budenholzer that we may not have gotten to on today's show. Leave those in the comments section, and we'll get to those throughout the week. So for Camille, I'm Justin. We thank everybody for tuning in once again here on Locked On Bucks. We'll talk to you once again next week.